I am Todd Goldberg. I am the director of the Graduate School in Creative Writing and Writing for the Performing Arts at UC Riverside, and your host tonight of Arts and Letters. We've been doing Arts and Letters now at UCR Palm Desert for, gosh, about 13 years, and we have not even let a pandemic stop us. We are so happy to be able to continue to do this online all throughout this last year. And I have to tell you, I already know who we're bringing out for fall when we're going to be in person. I've already got it all set up right here. Lots of cool people. But we're on Zoom tonight, which is great because it allows us to have a guest who is not in Southern California be right here with us tonight. And that is the fantastic poet, Michael Torres. His debut book, An Incomplete List of Names, is out now. It has received absolutely glowing reviews, and deservedly so. I knew Michael was going to be a big star. I have to tell you, this is the origin story. I knew Michael was going to be a big star when he inexplicably signed up for a very early class that I was teaching at UCR as an undergraduate. He was an undergraduate. I was teaching it. It was still very, very early. And he was, and if any of his classmates are in the room, I apologize. He was head and shoulders above every single person in that class, a remarkably gifted writer, at a very young age, and I have nothing to do with his success. He had it all on his own from the first time I read his work, and I remember it vividly. I was in my house and I was reading a short story he had written, and I said to my wife, "There's one in this class. There's one. There's a real one in this class, and I don't even know if he knows it." And my wife was like, "Well, don't be that horrible person who discourages him through your mean criticism," which I've been known to give. And I was like, "Well, we're gonna give him everything and see how he does." And he was remarkable. And so I was so happy to watch his progress as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate student in Minnesota. And then he started to get all of his stuff published, and then he got an NEA. He got an NEA. Michael Torres, my undergraduate student, got an NEA. He's a fellow for the National Endowment of the Arts, for God's sake. And then won the amazing National Poetry Series award for this book, his debut, and published by Beacon Press, which is a big deal. And now it's out, and he's huge. Juan Felipe Herrera blurbed him. I mean, that's the poet laureate of the United States. But here's how I really knew when Michael was ascending to greatness. I was listening to a podcast I like, hosted by Tracy K. Smith, who was also the poet laureate of the United States. And I was doing a thing I very rarely do, which is I was exercising. And she said, "I'm going to read this poem. It's a remarkable poem. It's by this new poet." And then she read a poem of Michael's as I was walking outside. And I was like, "Holy shit, that's Michael Torres." Tracy K. Smith, the poet laureate of the United States, just picked him for her show, The Showdown. And I lost it. I couldn't believe it. So when I was choosing who should be here for our lectures this pandemic season, I couldn't think of anyone better than my friend, the fantastic poet, Michael Torres. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Torres.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I don't know what to say. That's so... I'm honored. I do remember having being in one of your classes and like reading the wrong book for the first few weeks because you've told us to read Treasure Island, but it was like with 3 exclamation points, and I was reading the original Treasure Island and I had to like catch up. So like it wasn't all like great, but like it was fun.
After that point, after you caught up and we're like not reading Robert Louis Stevenson, after that you finally achieved greatness. Well, I'm so excited for you, Michael, and so proud of your success. This book of poetry, it's self-assured. I'm sure you have huge influences that are out there, but it reads like a one-of-a-kind thing. It reads like solely you. Your voice comes through in every single poem, your vulnerability, but it's a document about Southern California, about the inland Southern California. And so we're going to talk a bit about that. I want to talk a bit about your life and about some of the poems here. But the first thing I want to bring up is this great poem. It's on, if you're scoring at home, it's on page 92. And perhaps this will set us on our guide for our conversation here. It is a poem called "A List of What I Want to Be When I Grow Up," ages 7 through 28. And I met you, you were in your 20s. So at some point I knew you in one of these. Superman, a firefighter, football player, lawyer, professional wrestler, pro skater, tornado chaser, a fucking gangster, alive, sitting on chrome, paid, something like Pac, a poet, full-time with benefits, a good father. You are now 7 months into being a good father. So you had to wait a little bit past 28 for that. This is an amazing poem, because the subtext of every single thing that you wanted to be could be a novel, could be another book of poetry. Tell me about this man you wanted to be and this man that you are, and how it shows up in this book.
Well, I feel like I should start by saying that moment in that poem, I started writing that whole thing when I was like visiting California for like a week or something. And it was towards the end of my MFA program, and so like I was having all these feelings about like, okay, like now that the program's ending, where does my life go and who do I become, and do like will it work out to keep pursuing this thing, and what does it look like to kind of pursue poetry, something that doesn't like wasn't seen as any sort of masculine sort of career path or even a traditional career path at all from where I grew up. And so I was looking back on like what are the things that I wanted to be or thought about, and a lot of them had to do with like a lot of like daring things, and there were a couple like practical things. And so I was just kind of looking back on that, um, and seeing how it sort of led to poetry
Mhm.
anyway. Yeah.
Well, and I think that, there's a real power struggle throughout this book about who you are, who you were supposed to be in the eyes of other people,
Hmm.
who you thought you were supposed to be in the eyes of other people,
Yeah.
um, and this sort of kind and sensitive person struggling to fit in, um, to roles that maybe were assigned to you that you didn't want to play. Um, and so it's a fascinating book in that way, because because I know you a bit too. But I think any reader is going to see themselves in that struggle, irrespective of whether or not they grew up hard.
Hmm.
That my life was completely different than your life growing up, but the struggles that you had still bring me to real emotional resonance, because it's a struggle for self-identity, to be the
Yeah.
person you wanted to be all along. Um, so tell me a little bit about your growing up. You grew up in Pomona, right?
Yeah. Pomona, California. Um, so I'm the youngest of four siblings, and I'm like when I say youngest, I mean like 14 years younger than any of them, at least. So what I mean when I say that, I mean like growing up, like my best friends were like the people I looked up to, and like my brothers and sisters, and so just spent so much time out, around with them, and so like sort of like street life. It wasn't like hard like gangster stuff, but like I saw that. But then
Mhm.
whenever I returned home, especially when I was a lot younger, like 8, 9, and 10, my sister would like recite poetry to me, and like she went to Riverside too, and she took me to like a Shakespeare class with her when I was like 10. And so I had that like inside the house, but then I would go and see all these things happening, you know, that I put in the book, all these like just real shit and real stuff that happened like when I was out there. And so there was like a weird, interesting thing that was happening like simultaneously that I was like, I didn't know I was trying to understand and take in until I got older and realized that like, and even this is like recently like that I've started realizing that like poetry and creative writing was how I was able to be sensitive in ways that I couldn't in real life. Even like
Mhm.
when I felt that, and I tried to act tougher than that, and like I couldn't actually say those things. Like poetry was a way to sort of do that.
Well, you talk a lot in the book about these close relationships that the speaker has, and I presume most of the time the speaker is you, but I could be wrong, so you can correct me. These close relationships, these bonds that you have with your closest friends, and then guys that you were, you know, in a tagging crew with, and um, but then also sort of ancillary people that were floating around your world, and the challenge of sort of expressing gentle kindness to each other. So the book opens with a remarkable poem, um, the which has the greatest title in the history of poetry, which I'm going to read. I don't want to forget a single word of it, so I'm going to read it to you out loud. This is the greatest title in the history of American poetry, ladies and gentlemen. Doing donuts in an 87 Mustang 5.0 after my homie Chris gets broken up with. The greatest title in the history of American poetry. But that poem, and interestingly, I noticed a change in the version in your book versus the version I read originally. You did an edit to it, which is interesting. But it's about two young men trying to comfort, or one young man trying to comfort another young man after a breakup, and they comfort each other essentially by saying "fuck it" and nearly killing themselves.
Yeah.
What is it about the sort of proximity to death and violence as a way to show sort of emotional caring between young people, or just between men in general?
Um, in my experience growing up, it seemed that um, violence and that sort of machismo was its own sort of language, um, and so I knew when certain things happen like that, when someone gets upset and has it like they use these sort of physical ways to try to as a translation for I feel hurt, and I think I was just like I'd mentioned, I was very sensitive to that all my life, even though I never like really showed it, but just being there and being present to them, and like you mentioned, like in proximity to them, there was something unspoken that we both realized like we could be there for each other in that sort of in the physicality of whatever it meant, however it manifested. And I thought, as toxic or as unhealthy as that is, that was the only language that we thought we had or we felt that we had. And so I was trying to still, you know, mine that for something, because I felt it, worthy
Mm.
of poems or of like reflection.
Was that the relationship that you had with your siblings or with your dad also?
Mm, I want to say it was mostly strictly with my friends, because my relationship with my dad, and I still think about this a lot. I mean, who doesn't think about their relationship with their dad?
Yeah.
But
I got news for you.
um,
You got another 50 years of it.
yeah, yeah. Um, my dad wasn't ever like mean. He was actually really kind and moment at a lot for like random moments, but he was just very quiet. And I think
Mhm.
the way it was explained was that he didn't know um how to have a relationship with his children after they got to like adolescence, because
Right.
he didn't really have an adolescence. He started growing. He like only went to fifth grade and he started working, and then he moved or he migrated to the US when he was like 17. So I don't think he knew how to like deal with us or like how to just talk to us. All that to say, my relationship with him was very like much me looking for little clues or me looking for things he might do that would show a certain openness, where then I could find myself in, so like I in some ways, I guess I suppose that was a sort of way of learning that language. And then
Mhm.
the more physical or violent aspect of it was out with my friends. But I think that there's some correlation there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a number of times when your dad shows up in poems throughout the book, and he'll have a single physical thing that he does. He'll kick your tire, or you'll both stare at the same stretch of pavement, and um, and that will suffice to say I love you, basically. Um, and it made me think throughout reading this book. It's a book that is both permeated with sadness and kindness,
Mhm.
with this shadow of anger and violence that also exists. Like the violence and the anger is not up front. It's like, man, you can hear it behind what's happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and so I kept reading these great little stolen moments between you and your dad, or you and your brother, um, who at least in the book is incarcerated,
Mhm.
and like the attempt to find connection and understanding between the two of you, like you're processing it and putting it into your poems. I'm wondering, are they processing it also, do you think?
And that's the thing that I'm not, you mean like if they've read it and like
Yeah,
process it?
yeah,
I don't know. And there's something that like either I don't want to know or makes me sort of sad to know if they don't. Which isn't
right,
to say that I expect something from them, but like um that's one thing we were talking earlier before it started about the pandemic, how like I've been able to stay home and with my family and not having to leave them and travel. But the one thing I do miss is being able to talk to friends and talk to my brother, talk to my parents about like have deeper conversations about the book than like my mom saying that she's proud of me.
right,
Even now, like my mom will tell me that my dad's proud of me, but like me and my dad talk to each other through my mom, and so
right.
I have no real idea. And I don't know if it I don't know if I should have said that it made me sad. I think I've tried to accept the fact that like the poems might not ever solve anything, and I don't really want them to, but there's, as long as I put something that's true and honest and real, then there's not much else I can hope for
Right.
other than maybe it sort of resonates
You know,
internally.
it's funny. My dad and my mom were divorced, so when I spoke to my dad, which was very rarely, we only spoke through Major League Baseball.
Yeah,
Like you and your dad speak through your mom. Me
yeah.
and my dad would speak through the Oakland A's.
Oh, that's funny.
So you've got it a little bit better, I think.
We that's so you bring that up and it makes me think of like, I don't know if it's anywhere in the book, I can't remember, but like my oh, it's in that the poem you mentioned where like my dad's kicking my truck tires.
Mhm.
In like real life, uh my dad and I speak through like how you properly wash a car, and like and it's still like him giving me advice, but like it's kind of like a father son bonding moment. I'm like
Right.
learning how to wash the car properly, but we're not ever really talking about like, hey, I love you. I don't think I told him I loved him until I was in my mid 20s, and that was only because I was upset that he never said that to me. And then a
Right.
friend was like, well, why don't you tell it to him? I was like, I guess I could. And then but that was me being like my own like macho self. um yeah, yeah.
So when did you start creating writing? Like when did you start to actually write stuff down as a kid, or was it much later on in your life that you started to actually catalog what was going on in your experience?
um Probably closer to late adolescence was when I started writing these things down. I'd always had creative outlets, and like, I should say that my family's been very supportive of me, of all my creative expression. Even when I got caught doing graffiti, my mom was like disappointed, but she didn't like yell at me or anything.
Right.
Um, so I felt I was always able to express myself, and I think it was when I was 18 that I started writing poems and documenting those moments from adolescence, especially because, and and also this became more heightened when I went to UC Riverside. I was starting to go to community college,
Hmm.
and I noticed that I was very like alone, and none of my friends went with me. Like out of like maybe 12 of us, only one other friend went to college, and he went to a different college. And so um, it was just very lonesome. And I also had friends who I thought, I mean, and I had certain privileges, but like those friends were smart. I had friends who were really great graffiti artists who could have done other kind of arts, and I was just really upset that I was um, that not at them, but like at a certain system that I really didn't have a true sense of that, but that we weren't together, and I was really
Right.
upsetting. And so I wrote those experiences from adolescence sort of out of that frustration too, in
Hmm.
part at least.
So going back to your mom for just a sec, do you think she wasn't that upset because you were good? Like, did she see your talent and was like, well, yeah, I mean, he probably should not have tagged up that wall, but he's actually very, very talented.
um no, she was just so like she was just so nice and so like lenient about stuff. And so it was basically like my oldest sister, who was 19 years older than me, the one that used to take me to her Shakespeare class, was the one that was more stern with me.
Hmm.
And so I got um this sort of balancing out between them, because like I said, my dad wouldn't say much, even though my mom would be like, your dad's upset, I'd be like, yeah, whatever. um but my mom is all, I think she just like, she's like, she grew up Catholic, so I think she just really prayed hard that it would be okay for me, and I'd figure out a way, and she's really thankful that I did. But
Prayer
she liked,
paid.
yeah, she likes the arts, and she's always supported it. And I don't find that to be true of many like traditional Mexican American households. So I'm
Mm.
really grateful for that.
Well, the tagging and the graffiti plays a big role, obviously, in the poems, but as sort of a piece of self-expression. You talk about like the ability to see your name out there and to see your work out there, and for people to know you from your stuff being out there.
Yeah.
And that's like, is that almost the similar to the thrill of seeing, Michael Torres right here on the book? Did it give you that same kind of rush?
Yeah, it totally did. And I think another thing I'll say is that when we would do graffiti at night, we would often go back the next morning to see if it had been covered over or painted over or like crossed out or something, because it could happen that quickly. And I feel like, if anything, that taught me how to take rejection, because like, like especially the first few years, I was just getting rejected back and forth. So I'd have to like keep coming back with another batch of poems. But it was really nice to, I still remember um, the first time a literary magazine put my name on like their cover where it says like
Right.
featuring. I
Hmm.
felt like, oh damn, like that someone that my name's right there, and that felt like, I just felt so good about that, and I like just maybe want to write more successful poems.
Well, you know what is funny? I remember, not that I was stalking you, Michael, but I remember when you got the NEA, and there was an article that came out in some Minnesota press, and it was like gangster vandal to
Oh yeah,
scholar or something like
yeah,
that. And I was like, well, that's Minnesota's point of view about what you were doing, but
yeah,
it's not LA's point of view. It's not Pomona's point of view. What Pomona's point of view is like, you're doing what everyone's doing. You're out there
yeah.
doing that thing. What was that sort of experience like? Like, I'm sure you must remember the article I'm speaking of.
Yeah, yeah, it was like something like from Vandal to Scholar or something. Just because I just, in one of the questions, I told the reporter, yeah, I used to do graffiti, and they like jumped on that.
Oh God.
Um, I don't. I think I just like file that under just like the life I've had in Minnesota, which
Right.
is like that there are just, it's a totally different culture here. I love a lot
Mhm.
of things about it, but some things are just like it just, I mean, there's so much more, much more of a diverse um, culture and like understanding of all these sort of different backgrounds in California,
Mhm.
that when someone, I was gonna say something, when someone like me pops up in Minnesota, and it's so different from like, I don't know, like a regular upbringing, they like want to really highlight that. And it's I don't know, in some ways I feel like at first I was just kind of happy to be like put on the newspaper, and now I'm just kind of like, I don't know, like, how are you gonna try to play this angle?
Right.
um
Well, and you talk
yeah,
about that a little bit in one of the poems where you say like, I don't like the word adversity as much as I should,
yeah,
essentially, or I don't like the way it sounds, I don't like the way it looks. Um, because it's not like you were in Minneapolis, right? You were in Mankato, which is a very small town, right? When you
yeah.
went to grad school.
Yeah.
So that evolution's like, so you started writing, in adolescence. You started doing more creative writing when you were in junior college. Obviously, you're a creative writing major, an English major at UC Riverside, but you start really taking it seriously when you go to get your master's degree. But you end up going to a place where I vividly recall saying to you, "Are you sure you want to go to there?" Because
Yeah.
I was frankly worried. Like I was like, I don't know how many Torreses you're going to run into in Mankato.
Yeah.
And I finally I was right about something. But you really blossomed there as a writer, obviously, because you're still there and you achieved great things. But you did a lot of cool stuff too, like you were working in the teaching in the prisons and stuff. Tell us a little bit about what that life was like and the influence of Minnesota life on your writing now.
Yeah. So it is a very small town. It's a town that wants to be a city because it's surrounded by a bunch of farmland. Um, I knew that when I was coming here or when I was applying to MFAs, that wherever I went, I was going to really dedicate my time to focus on writing. And so, even though it was a small town and like the winters were long, we have like 5 or 6 month winters.
Like,
I thought, yeah, I know. I thought that that was still, I think I just tried to turn everything into like, how can I use this to my advantage and focus on writing. And so like I used those things. I also had a really great cohort, great mentors here. Um, and I was in sort of like this bubble of academia too, where
mhm.
like there were a few times, maybe one of them shows up in the book where I was able to see and experience what conservative southern Minnesota was like. And then I was like, oh shit, like I don't like this at all. Um, just because like I can't like convince everybody of like that I'm I don't know, a regular human person. And so I don't need
Right.
to. And so like I think what it was pretty much close to I was always like, while I was in the MFA, I was always trying to do extracurricular things and then find like what's the next thing I'm going to do,
Mhm.
And I think during my third and last year, I was like, okay, how do I continue to have a community post grad school? And my wife, girlfriend at the time, had gotten into this writing community up in the Twin Cities through the Loft Literary Center, and I basically kind of followed what she was doing and applied to the same thing. And so my first year out of grad school, I was in this mentor series and met these really great writers up in the Twin Cities, made a lot of good connections, and that's kind of through that group was how I ended up, getting connected with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop and teaching through them. And
Mhm.
I just tried to make the most of those connections I made and those friends I made, because I felt like I felt like what I'd seen after grad school is that like it's really hard to keep writing unless you have like you need a couple things. You need like either like a really solid routine or you need like that community, that group of people who are gonna like ask to see your work, because
Right.
you're not gonna have a workshop class and after that asking for your work.
So how did that square with the kid that wanted to be a fucking gangster? Like you wanted to be a fucking gangster, you wanted to be Tupac. You also wanted to have full-time job with benefits, and now you're working in the prisons. Um, teaching writing in the prisons, teaching expression probably to people who are not real comfortable telling strangers about who they are.
Yeah.
What did you find about that experience? What was that like?
I love teaching in the prisons. And I'll say about the me that wanted to be a gangster. When I think I what I didn't say about when I was like a graffiti artist, that older sister who really was wanting to make sure I went to college. Let me borrow Luis J. Rodriguez's memoir, Always Running, and it was about
Mhm.
this like gangster who like lives this gangster life, but at the same time, I was like, oh, he wrote a book. If
Right.
he wrote this book, like I can write the book. And so like I just thought like, okay, that's a way in. And so um, and then that sort of made me more comfortable with um, taking writing seriously. And then I loved being a student. So by the time I finished grad school and was starting to teach with the prison writing workshop, I was at this I wanted to do what Luis J. Rodriguez did for me, which was make or like let these other writers who just happen to be incarcerated, like show them that they could write too,
Mhm.
and that like the way the way that they talk naturally could be a way to speak in a poem that
Mhm.
they didn't have to have a sort of elevated language that like I even had in when I have like really old scraps of notes where I'm trying to like use multisyllabic words every line. Um,
And
and,
whilst. Try to get whilst in there.
yeah, yeah, thou and all that. Um, but I think that's always like the greatest like obstacle in with those classes in the prison is just like they think that they don't have the language or that they don't have the right vocabulary because they don't have that elevated. And so like when we kind of like write free write based on like just how they talk, we can have breakthroughs, and then I can ask them, and then I can get to the important things like, well, what does this actually look like, and like how like tell me about what this looks like based on how you feel, and then and
Mhm.
get to like the real something real and true that they can share with each other. um yeah, and that takes time to build trust with them too.
Well, you know what's interesting to me about your work, Michael, and maybe this comes through also talking to some of these uh, guys that are in prison, is like the influence of hip hop is clear in your work, but it's like the two sides of it. It's like the gangster hip hop, but then there's also like the Kendrick hip hop, right?
Hmm.
Where it's like you can be of the streets, you can know of the streets, you might not have a gun, but you know a guy who does have the gun.
Yeah.
You can be the reporter, the documentarian, but not the main character,
Yeah.
Um, and so there's something in your poems that speaks to that sort of experience in a similar way.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm wondering if that's something that you are conscious of, but also if it's something that you use when talking to the inmates about like, hey man, like this thing that you want to talk about, hey, like the game's been talking about it for 30 years. You
Hmm.
know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that comes from um I feel like in my poems I use a lot of like we, like
Hmm.
the communal, point of view as a way to say that like I was in this community too, but also so that I'm not like, because I'll critique things, or things that men do in the book, but I'll never like, I feel like if I throw them under the bus, then I have to throw myself under the bus too. Like I'll
Right.
never, just kind of like point them out. Like, and so I think to me that's sort of like the Kendrick or the Talib Kweli is like it's conscious. It's like
Right.
it might be critique, but it's also like self critique as at the same time, so that it's not like so you're not trying to school them and they don't feel like so because I even said we right now, they and we already always feel like someone's ready to talk down to us like quickly if they need to, and so
Mhm.
I'm trying to keep a level sort of playing field, I guess.
Well, and we talked about this a bit at the top, and I know that there's going to be some questions from the audience. We'll get to you guys in just one sec. Um, about this, this tug and this pull for you between the the two lives that you have, the Professor Torres, basically, and uh, the homie, right? And there's this great poem very early on in the book where you're sitting in a professor's home and you're drinking wine, and you're thinking about you're the guy who just said basically like, oh, thank you for the lovely glass of wine, and you're about to use the word dichotomy and all this stuff, and then there's that moment where you're about to leave and you want to say, what you would say, like, stay up, but can you say that to your professor? And that I just absolutely love that moment. And maybe it's because I'm I can imagine you in that situation, but also just like, aren't we beyond that thing where we have to fake our language? But of course we're not, like you have to code switch constantly in this life. You do. Um, I do a little less, a lot less. When you're writing a poem like that, though, when you're talking about yourself in a real life situation, though maybe fictionalized at the moment, are you also thinking about the people that are going to invite you to dinner? And are imagining you sitting there, imagining yourself trying to figure out the right thing to say?
Um, I mean, I don't know if this is the way that you, this is the way I understood the question, is that like I wrote that poem, or I write poems like that so that like if that professor reads it, first of all, I don't think they'll say anything to me. Second, I think if they did say something, the poem is like, the poem puts the ball in my court for me to
Right.
be like, oh well, this is, let's talk about this then, because I shape the conversation because I give you this poem. So that's, I mean, that's kind of like how I've thought about that too. Yeah, those poems, like especially like the ones where I'm like code switching and like thinking really hard about not just like my Mexican American identity, but also like my identity in academia versus my academia, like when I go to Cali,
Mhm.
is like those came way later on in the manuscript. And part of it has to do with like, finally writing poems based in Minnesota. And the other part having to do with like sort of realizing I'm not going to go back to California anytime soon. And so that I'm coming to terms with my life in Minnesota, which is a life in academia. And like, what does that mean?
Mhm.
And like, what do I feel safe to say and safe to do? And what do I have to like be careful about because I don't have tenure, because
Right.
my family isn't wealthy, and I have like, you could kind of lose it all. Like, like not maybe that dramatic, but like things like that could happen. I don't have a lot to fall back on. And
Right.
so I have to be very, feel very careful. But I feel like, yeah, the writing the poem puts the ball in my court, that I would be down to have the conversation, but like I want it shaped around what I want it shaped around.
Right. Well, you know what's so interesting to me is you write the poems that take place in Minnesota in a different voice than you write the poems that take place in California. Even though I know you're writing most of them in Minnesota,
Mhm.
like it's a I want to say it's like, oh man, I can feel the sun in a poem where you're leaping over a fence and running down the street and your homies hopping out of a car and getting into a fight. Like I can smell the asphalt and I can see the sun. But
Yeah.
when you're talking about Minnesota, those are much more claustrophobic poems. Like I feel like I am inside and there's a lot of wood paneling. Um, and it's a different experience. And maybe it's conscious, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just like in your memory, you're conveying what it was like running down that. Like I just see you running down the street
Mhm.
in a white t-shirt over and over and over again in my head when I'm reading these. So maybe that's me just knowing the region, right? I don't know. So last thing, and then we'll get to some questions because I see there's some hands raised. Everything that's happened for you recently has happened really fast. You've had just this sort of thing that's happened. You got the NEA, you've gotten all these wonderful fellowships. I know you were in France for a time.
Yeah.
This fucking great book, pardon my language, just came out and is getting great reviews. Publishers Weekly gave it a review that you should frame and tattoo on your back underneath Pomona. Um, what has that been like for you, and how do your friends back home, do they understand sort of where you are now, like where you are in your profession? Do they get it, and what's that been like talking to them about it?
For my friends, another this is like another thing with that the pandemic has sort of like done, is that like I don't know exactly like the level to which they realize like how much things have happened for me. I don't know. Part of me is like very much okay with I don't think they would treat me any different anyway, but part of me is like, I don't know, I just still want to be Remick to them. And that has to do with like guilt and like loyalty and like feeling guilty about like not going back home. So I
Right.
mean, um I think if anything, they're really proud of that this is that I'm doing this thing, and that I've stuck to it enough, and have had, what like the success that I've had. Um, it's weird. It's a little bit weird to me because I don't think I expected certain things. Like one friend I have, this was probably 2 years ago when had still been visiting before all this happened, but when he would introduce me to like new friends that he's made and be like, "Oh, this is my homie Mikey." he would say like, "This is my homie Mikey, comma the professor," and that like threw me off for a second because then me and my writer mind was like, oh, like how should I perform right now? Like that was like unconsciously what was going on in my head. And so like
Right.
and then I bring that back to the page. And so um I don't know, I kind of like that, we still hit each other up. Like they ask, I ask how their parents are doing, they ask how my parents are doing, and then when's the next time I'm coming down and things like that. And those are the things that we talk about. It keeps me grounded because I do know, and I am so grateful for how much has happened so quickly in the last, especially last 2 years.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, I just want to write. I just want to write more um, truthful stuff, and like I don't know, I just want to keep on writing. So yeah,
Like when I saw you in the New Yorker, I was
yeah,
pretty goddamn excited.
yeah, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was, ladies and gentlemen, the understatement of the year, Michael Torres. Yeah, it was pretty cool being the New Yorker. Dude, you were the New Yorker. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
It's amazing.
It is. I don't want it to make it seem like it's nothing. It's a weird thing. It's like a lot of people, not every, that's such a big publication. I just want to, I don't know. I keep telling myself like, okay, like, keep it about the work, I don't know.
Right. Well, and it has to be. I mean, it's the work that has gotten you to this very nice position in your life right now. Like
Yeah.
that's one of the really cool things is all the stuff that's happened for you is because of you. It's because of you. It's because of your ability to look at this world and to frame it in a way that only you can. Only you could write a poem about doing donuts in an '87 Mustang 5.0 with your buddy Chris after someone's broken up with him.
Yeah.
Um, it's just so cool. So I know I saw a hand up from Lindsay. Lindsay, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A or into the chat, and I'll pull it up, and I will answer it for you, or we'll ask it of Michael. In the meantime, the other thing that I think was most striking to me about the book, and sort of my experience reading it right now, is how unapologetic it is. You put everything about yourself and about your life out there, and it made me think, like, just as a person who writes fiction, like that's the thing I can't do.
Mm.
That's the veil I get to hide behind. Is I get to not reveal my darkest, deepest secrets. Um, with this larger stage that you're on, has it changed the way you approach writing this sort of confessional type work?
um, no, if anything, it makes me want to be more honest about myself, and like ask more questions about myself and like the things that I experienced and the decisions I made. I think because I try not to think of it as confessionalism, I like to think of it as, um, I don't know, just not confessionalism, because I think like maybe this is my Catholic upbringing, is that like I don't have a sense of like that I feel guilty about it. I'm
Hmm.
like just saying like I'm trying to be the, I would like to be the person that says like this is a true thing that happened, so that someone else can either say that that is true for them too, or that they can feel it and there's some sort of acknowledgement, even if it's unspoken. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And that's a real thing that has weight to it. And so I want to do that even more in the work. And I think because I'm also starting to do more creative nonfiction too, and that's like very there.
Well, and so many of your poems, of course, have a real narrative quality. And when when I think of some of the poets who have meant the most to me in recent years, I think of a writer like Natalie Diaz, who combines narrative and poetry together in a really seamless way, and in a really powerful way. Okay, we have some questions here. Let me grab them. Going back to when you mentioned machismo and how some of that culture has influenced your writing, what else in Mexican culture or social attitudes have shaped more of your feeling and how has that gone into your writing?
Um, a lot of it is machismo and like it's touched on in the book, like homophobia.
Hmm.
The other thing that that it's like culturally, eh, or like like to me Mexican cultural is that like the women or the mother is always like in the background, and I don't think I noticed that writing this first book until the book was like completely done, and I was like, okay, it feels like something complete. And then I noticed it was so very male, and
Hmm.
like not that that was bad because I was doing some critiques, I was doing some, honoring, but I think in my more recent explorations in poetry, I'm trying to look at like writing about my mother, writing about my sister, and also saying like in the poems, like why am I afraid to write about them, or like why do I feel shame in writing about them, or like what is it about the dismissiveness of Mexic traditional Mexican culture that makes this so, and like how am I going to like come into that in a poem that sort of
Hmm.
explores that in a very um, honest way, though probably guilt ridden.
That's a good point. All right, good answer. All right, next question. The memories and physicality of the poems are so vivid. How you go into memory? How do you think about what's most important to you about recovering the memory? The poem Todd mentioned. The poem Todd mentioned, doing donuts. It's also a very delicate poem. Even the volume is calibrated.
Hmm.
Um, how do you mine your memory for that kind of touch?
Yeah, so with that poem as an example, usually the physicality will stem from like that original image, and like when that poem started in the very first draft form, it was just this car spinning, and I sort of had to get closer to it and describe it, and then start wondering like, well, why is this car spinning? Then who's in this car? Am I the driver? I'm not the driver. Am I, where am I? Am I watching this from somewhere else? No, I'm sitting shotgun. Why am I sitting shotgun? And sort of just asking questions like of that image and of that poem
Mhm.
over like months, right? To sort of see where it's at. And even you had mentioned that it was the version in the book is different from the version that's published online, was because when I published it online and I was looking over it again for the book, I realized that like I think the only line that's changed is that
I'm
my
scared.
speak yeah, my
Yeah.
speaker thinks that out
Mhm.
loud, or he thinks that, and the reader knows it. And I was, and at that, going back to the question, like I was turning the volume, I wanted to turn the volume down on the speaker and just illuminate more the driver, Chris. So I
Mhm.
turned down the volume on like even what I was thinking, and just sort of let the reader see that the speaker, was scared because of how he like grabbed the pennies, but it was not saying I'm scared. It was showing it, but also in this very sort of violent way by making a fist. And I
Mhm.
thought that would better show um, how the speaker was like experiencing this moment with Chris, than to sort of, because to say I'm scared is also a bit judgmental, a little bit passing judgment on Chris, and I didn't want the speaker to do that at all. So like I had, yeah, there was a lot of calibration to that, and like trying to
Yeah.
see like,
And
yeah,
maybe if you're not a Michael Torres completist like I am, you don't even notice the change. But I had like I remembered that line that
yeah,
he says, he says fuck it because he doesn't say I'm scared or
yeah,
whatever the line is in the original version. And then when I read it in the book, I was like, oh, he cut that.
yeah,
Oh. So
yeah,
I have the original version framed, and then this one I have laminated.
yeah.
Okay. Lindsay says, Michael, do you feel like you still need to return to California, perhaps later in life? Do you feel like a visitor where you are now? Would being in California give you more variety of expression or hinder your creativity?
Uh, like as in Return to California, like literally, and like in the, I guess I'll answer both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always gonna want to go back. Um, in real life and in the work, I think I'm okay with. I've accepted that like I will probably always write about like that. I'll always base things in California because I think there's so much more to like mine from there. Like I was
Mhm.
mining California experiences as a, in my as a late 20-year-old, as an early 30-year-old. I'll be doing it when I'm in my 40s and 50s, hopefully, you know. But California has changed, and I think that'll be part of why I keep writing about it, because it's so different. I have this like I had this line, and I had written something for poetry, the Poetry Foundation, where I said, like, I have certain lines that I don't know what to do with, and one of them has to do with, like, I had gone back to California, and I was like, I think it was like my mom had picked me up from the airport or something, but I was driving. She was driving me back through the old neighborhood, and like I was looking at we passed by my elementary school, and there was like a big like wrought iron gate around it, and I wrote this line immediately that went, everything I love has a fence around it.
Mhm.
And just because like I couldn't, it was so hard, so difficult for me to like understand the changes that were happening, and part of that had to do with the fact that I had left this place, and so
Right.
there's always going to be that sort of grappling that in like a real personal sense is sort of sad, but in a writer sense is like very fascinating to me, and
Mhm.
that I really want to like go after that thing.
Well, that reminds me of a line in your book right now where you're remembering your childhood, and you say there was a time in my childhood or in my youth where all my friends were down for whatever, and I don't
Mhm.
know why. And I'm paraphrasing you incidentally, but like just trying to figure out like why was everyone down for whatever.
Yeah.
It's like there's still a mystery out there, right? California and your memory still has unanswered questions. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Let's see here.
Yeah.
We've got Andrea has a question. Andrea, one of our fine MFA students. How does Michael build trust among inmates so that he can read their work and get them to be honest and confident in their sharing?
I just kind of meet them wherever they begin, and then I'm very honest about like how I feel about the poems, but I'm also trying to be very um nurturing and tell them like, well, like I mean, I am genuinely interested when I have a question about like, well, what do you mean by this? If they have a free write and they raise their hand to share, like I'll ask like to dig a little deeper, and I think I build trust because I do get like genuinely excited by like seeing that they're starting to shape something that to me could become a poem. They might not realize it yet, but like, and that's part of my job to be like, yeah, that what you just said, write that right there, and just like the sheer excitement for that. And that's part of why I love teaching, is because I feel like I do this energy. I feel like it's reciprocated, and I bring it from whatever I'm working on that day. And so it's just a thing that takes time, and just being genuinely and seeing them as writers, because that's a thing that they bring up about um what other people how other people see them, is that like they only see them as prison writers, and I always
Right.
had seen them as just writers, because they had a lot of raw talent. It's just that they never were told that they had that.
Mhm.
And so just being very careful to like um you know get that out of them and let them see it themselves.
Yeah, that's got to be something that um, to build trust, just to let them know that you don't see them as a compendium of their worst traits,
Hmm.
right? Like you see them for this thing that they're doing right here.
Yeah.
That's a lot, man. That takes a lot of you and of them. I think that's really cool. So, someone had a question also about more information about how to find out about teaching in the prisons. I don't know if you happen to know a good resource just in general, but perhaps in California, do you know anything?
uh in California, I don't. um Yeah, I wouldn't know other than to Google this thing. I know that, I mean, just because the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop is like just a Minnesota thing, we're not like
Right.
connected anywhere else. Um, I know, I know that like that Penn does like work
Yeah,
with the
they do.
prisons.
Right. Right.
So maybe if you go to the like Penn's website, they might have something with resources or like how to like help somehow. Other than that, yeah, I don't know. I never got to do that in California. I did like other youth outreach stuff, but never like prison work. Not there, not
Okay.
yet, at least.
So Ray, the person who asked the question, I'll do a little bit of research. If you email me, and Maggie can put my email address into the chat, I'll see if I can get some information for you, because I know that we have a couple students who have who've done some teaching in the prisons also. So we'll see if we can get some info back for you, Ray. Michael, thank you so much for spending some frozen Minnesota time on Zoom.
Thank you.
Michael's debut, An Incomplete List of Names, is out right now. It is absolutely incredible. I loved it. I've marked every single page. I should also let you know that I had Michael come out and teach my MFA students, so not just prisoners, because he's an amazing teacher. So if there's anyone out there, say, at UCLA, and they're looking to hire someone that they could bring back to teach poetry in California, who'd maybe like to bring a great American poet back out, well, you should contact me. I can give you a reference. An Incomplete List of Names by Michael Torres. It is out right now. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us tonight. I hope you come back, folks. In April, we're going to be joined by Emily Rapp Black and Gina Frangello to talk about their brand new books. That will be a fun and fascinating night of me feeling super uncomfortable talking to my two friends, Gina and Emily. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate it.